I'm Liza Oliver, Director of the Pluralism Initiative and Associate Professor of Art History, and I'm very happy to introduce this evening Yael Berda. Yael is a lawyer and associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and she's also a fellow of the Middle East Initiative at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Berda teaches, researches, and writes on the intersections of sociology of law, race, and imperial rule, and she studies the ways that bureaucracies shape politics and the colonial legacies of modern empires. She's written numerous articles and 3 books, among them Living Emergency, Israel's Permit Regime in the Occupied West Bank with Stanford University Press in 2017, and recently Colonial Bureaucracy and Contemporary Citizenship, Legacies of Race and Emergency in the Former British Empire with Cambridge University Press. Professor Berda completed her PhD in sociology at Princeton University and her postdoctoral work at the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies. Formerly a human rights lawyer, Berda is highly engaged in political and social change. Among others, she is chair of Ir Amim on the board of A Land for All and Academia for Equality. She'll be in conversation this evening with Lidwien Kapteijns, Elisabeth Kimball, and Elisabeth Hodder Professor of History. Professor Kapteijns is a historian of African and Middle Eastern history and the author of several books, including Clan Cleansing in Somalia, The Ruinous Legacy of 1991, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press, and the co-edited volume Mediations of Violence in Africa, Fashioning New Futures from Contested Past in 2010 with Brill. So after their discussion, there will, as usual, be a Q&A, and we never put the camera on students when asking questions to protect your privacy. And so please join me in welcoming both Professors Berda and Kapteijns. Thank you.
Thank you, Liza, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. So we intend to stop our conversation at around 6 so that we can leave time for questions from the audience. Since not everybody has read Yael's book, the questions about the present and the future are also welcome. And we will collect questions, probably 3 at a time, so that people can ask a lot of questions if they want to. And then at 6:30 we will stop, but if anybody wants to come up a little closer into our lion's pit here, then you can certainly continue the conversation in a smaller scale still. But usually when there is an end point, people start leaving and it becomes very kind of chaotic. And I think we have enough chaos in our lives and around us right now. So I wanted to start with asking Yael the following. Since these are unusual times with a lot of vengeance in the air, I wanted to begin with asking you how you are. You have been a strong critic of Israeli government from before your second book, Living Emergency, Israel's Permit Regime in the Occupied West Bank, which was published in 2019 or 18 in Stanford. And even though your double citizenship may offer some protection, both in the US and in Israel, I believe, critics are vulnerable right now. And moreover, since you work so closely with other critics across the various lines, including Palestinians, I wanted to ask you how your colleagues are doing.
Thanks for having me, and thank you all for coming. If you want to sit closer, it just feels like, hello, who's out there? I just want to, before we get into it, I just want to acknowledge this time, such a difficult time. I want to acknowledge those who were killed on October 7th. I want to acknowledge over at least 50,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza. I want to acknowledge hostages remaining. I want to acknowledge the displaced, the wounded in body and in mind. This, and also those that are deeply affected around the globe that have both interests and care in across the territory. And this is a difficult time. It's a difficult time because also we're all demanded constantly to show our loyalties and choose sides and all kinds of things that are understood, but not necessarily helpful. So I want to also say that if you get annoyed and upset, please don't leave the room. We can handle this. And also that I don't know how this is for you, right? So locally, you experience things different than we do. And so that might also sometimes feel strange. So you can ask questions about that, or even tell me or clarify something that I don't understand about what's going on here. And so yes, the situation is it's volatile, but like, so I've been a critic for a very long time. It has changed in the past, say from 2015, it changed because of the growing power of right-wing NGOs that went after lecturers and students. But, you know, there is this difference between being Jewish and being a Palestinian faculty member or students. And I have not felt scared. Recently, there was, so Palestinian faculty and Palestinian students, they do not express themselves politically today because of fear of retaliation, but also fear that like what they say will be interpreted as dangerous and can have consequences of arrest and interrogation and different things. Recently, there was a campaign against me in November because I wrote an op-ed in Haaretz about what I claimed was ethnic cleansing in Gaza. And then a right-wing Im Tirtzu NGO, I don't know if you know. So they put a campaign to fire me, and it's an email campaign. You probably know how this works. It's an email campaign in which an email is sent to the rector and the president and a whole bunch of people saying, please fire Professor Berda because she wrote this thing. And so they wanted to get 500 emails, but they only got 330, so I was really happy about that. There was a moment, there were a few hours where I was like, you know, because it feels scary also, because you're being called out as being a traitor or as being disloyal to your society, and that feels terrible. But the thing is that the stakes for me, I have tenure, and I got my professorship, and I don't feel as vulnerable as some others. Yeah, I mean, I think that fear is also, it's not equal. Some of us are more scared than others, and that's also okay.
Thank you for that. So my first kind of substantial question is the following. So in colonial bureaucracy and contemporary citizenship, legacies of race and emergency in the former British Empire, which is the title of this very impressive, complex book for which he did a lot of archival work, which will please historians, obviously. You lay out in great detail how the legacy of British colonial rule by emergency and the bureaucratic toolkit of emergency shaped the post-partition ways in which India and Israel, less so Cyprus, managed the populations that became minorities in the post-partition state. You emphasize especially the file and the checkpoint. I think that's very also poetic, because they really summarize the bureaucratic file and the checkpoint. Really, I think, are great metaphors for the work that you've done. Emphasizing how specific colonial bureaucratic practices, namely state classification of populations based on suspicion, and the ordering of mobility through emergency laws, have contributed to the making of citizenship in the long aftermath of partition. And this last was a quote. In other words, you connect emergency laws to the restrictions on mobility, which anybody who follows US politics today sees emergency laws and restrictions on mobility, and population classification based on suspicion to shape and undermine or differentiate a citizenship of people in these states. And that is, of course, especially but not exclusively Muslims in India, and especially Palestinians, and not exclusively, maybe also even in Israel. So can you explain that to an audience that may not yet have read your work?
I love the yet. Yeah, so first of all, I mean, I set out on this journey to figure out the origins of the laws that govern the occupied territories, which are the Defense Emergency Regulations of 1945, which were created by the British Mandate government. And this is a set of tools that, first of all, is very, very powerful. And I come across it also as a lawyer and also as I'm writing Living Emergency, which was my second book, because that's the template for the territory. And I have to figure out, like, where does this come from? And that's where I begin this kind of journey backward, looking at the biography of the emergency defense regulations, and coming, so it's interesting because I thought that I was going to do a biography of Israel-Palestine, but then I came across this wonderful anthropologist named Vizira Zamindar, who wrote this book called The Long Partition and the Making of South Asia. And this is my first year at Princeton. And I'm listening to her, and she's talking about this unique permit system that happens right after independence. And I walk up after, and I say to her, you know, I mean, I know you said it's unique, but it's not unique because we had the exact same thing. And suddenly it dawns on me that it's the same toolkit. And we start to talk, and we can't stop talking because everything is similar. The forms and the names of these permits. And so all of this is kind of bringing me to question, what is this thing that makes practices similar? I mean, India and Israel, they're so different. And how come they're, you know, how do you explain the similarity? And so then I very long, windy road, and I figure out that there's this toolkit that starts in a little bit after, so it begins in the First World War, but right after it in 1919 becomes, it proliferates across India as they're trying to use counterinsurgency methods. And it develops, it's not created as a toolkit. It's like these set of laws, public safety laws, and all kinds of clauses that allow for censorship and allow for preventative detention, and something called the Disturbed Areas Act and foreigner registration, and it's all this stuff that basically allows the colonial government to survey and to slow down the movement of population and watch the registration of people, and then, you know, kind of moving around in the Delhi archive, the All India archive, I start to see it everywhere. And that's when I wondered when it moves. When does this move to Mandate Palestine? And then happens this amazing thing, you know, in the archive. And it was not in India. This was in the Kew archive in London, and I find this little booklet that somebody had taken. It was a collection of emergency laws and anti-terrorism laws from 1942, and in pencil. And this is in one of the files of the Mandate Palestine government. And in pencil, they're crossing out the stuff that is irrelevant, adding things that are relevant, and writing to each other. And, you know, one of the wonderful things about researching British colonial bureaucrats is that they all write in these minutes. And so once you've learned how to read their handwriting, you know exactly like what they're saying, even if it's just these tiny markings. And so, and basically what it was, here are these emergency laws used in Bengal in 1942, and then they're copied and used in 1945 and adapted. So they're not as is. It's not a copy-paste situation, but it's an adaptation, and they're trying to also figure out how things are different. So they don't have a Criminal Tribes Act, right? Because that's in India. You don't have criminal tribes in Band-Aid Palestine, but how do you translate the type of tools that were in there? And so, of course, in Cyprus, during the Cyprus emergency, they're using, 1955, they're using this same toolkit. So this is the bureaucrat, what I call the bureaucratic toolkit of emergency, and it's created between the two world wars, and then you have this set. So then what happens with this toolkit after independence? So during the colonial government, it's basically used against everybody, differentially, but it's used against everybody. But once there's independence, what the states do is they take this arsenal, this bureaucratic toolkit, and they use it against the minorities or remainder populations following partition or the War of Independence, Nakba. And so what you have is this same set of tools that was built for counterinsurgency is actually used for the classification, surveillance, and monitoring of the minority populations, and also the prevention of their return. So this is why partition becomes such an important part of the story. And so at the beginning, this was a hard sell. Like, what do you mean citizenship is a mobility regime? How, like, citizenship is about rights, they're given. You know, what is this? What are you talking about? And it was, I was lucky that South Asian historians, young historians, were writing projects about the different borders of both the eastern and western borders of the citizenship regime that was being created through the permit system, through these types of differentiated mobility possibilities. And that was a way that I could understand how citizenship could be created by the fact that you actually had a document that you could claim that you then belonged. It didn't mean that you had rights, but it was what Hannah Arendt calls, it made you non-deportable, because that piece of paper linked the individual to the territory. And that brought me to this idea that it's not that citizenship is always about mobility, but for minorities or remainder populations, and particularly after partition, that's what it meant. Is that different populations have different possibilities for mobility. And I mean, in Israel-Palestine, that kind of analysis really works, because what we do is we have Palestinian citizens of Israel, we have the residents of East Jerusalem, we have West Bank Palestinians, Palestinians in Gaza, and in the early years, the very early years, when there were I'm trying to think of how do I say this in English, ma'abarot, so like the camps that were for, the immigration camps that were for Jews that had arrived from Arab and Islamic countries, there was a permit regime there too, much less harsh, but it was definitely, there were mobility restrictions, there was the necessity to gain access, and so you do have this also to a much lesser degree and for a shorter time, also on some Jewish populations. Now,
Shall I come in here?
yes, sorry, I could just go on.
Just because I'm going to ask more about the same, but giving you a new entry point. So one of the things that you talk about is a hybrid bureaucracy, right? Mm-hmm. And some of the aspects of that you mentioned, that it involved consistent bureaucratic and legal arbitrariness, and it included classification based on racial hierarchy and differentiation. It included classification based on region, occupation, political affiliation, and degree of suspicion, and then restrictions on mobility, as you already said, based on such classification. and the impossibility, and this was, I think, your experience also as a human rights lawyer, to hold any individual responsible as security decisions operate under emergency and thus outside of the law and outside of the reach of the courts of law. And so it's in that case that you talk about the bureaucratic toolkit of emergency, about which you already have said some things. But could you talk a little bit about the classification system and its impact? So it is, you said the file and the checkpoint, right? So the file being partly this classification system, and then the checkpoint, the mobility that you have spoken to already quite a bit. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
No,
it does make sense, but I want to say something before. Like, when you describe it now, it's almost like you have this really, like, organized system, and it knows what it's doing, and it's, you know, systematic.
Who was organized?
And, I mean, it's so much messier than that, so contradictory, so not goal-oriented in that sense. And it's interesting because there's a lot of contradictions within the hybrid system, but that's part of it.
Inefficiency.
Right. I call it effective inefficiency. So it's inefficiency, but it's inefficient in any kind of, like, when you think of administration as, you know, kind of this Weberian model that doesn't really exist anywhere, but that's the way we think of bureaucracy. So it's everything but that, but it's also wrong to think that it's just a messed up bureaucracy or that something's wrong with it. It functions for certain things that help monitor, slow down the movement of a population, and also it replaces the need for physical violence with the creation of uncertainty and a dependency on official documents and decisions in order to conduct your daily life. Now, part of this, I mean, all bureaucracies have some arbitrariness in it. And all bureaucracies have some patrimonial aspects. And all bureaucracies, sometimes things are outside the reach of the law. So it's not that here's something that is completely different. I think what is different about, this is what I'm claiming, what is different about colonial bureaucracy, and I do think that there is a blueprint for it, is that you have this ability, or you need the ability, to classify different populations and then attach different practices to them. And this never ends. It's not just that you have 2 groups or even 3 groups. It's a mode of thinking in which you say, okay, what I need to do now is prevent this movement. So now I'm going to make a specific regulation for this group, be it from a certain type of worker that is necessary. So, like, the idea of essential workers, and then creating an exception for that branch, and then having to create all these classifications within and exceptions within, and then you have exceptions to the exceptions. No one can follow this, really, but it's a technique that allows you basically to maintain a facade of a liberal system, but constantly undermine it at the same time.
And you actually say that in the West Bank, it is a colonizing, an effective way of colonizing Palestinian time and space, right? You did say that, I think.
I don't think in that way exactly, because it would be one. So bureaucracy is not an all-encompassing thing. You need a set of tools, other tools.
But if it is so labyrinthian,
yes,
and that even you as a human rights lawyer could never get in the end an answer about why somebody was denied entrance, because then at the end there is the emergency exception of security, And so you did kind of describe it as the fact that both the space and the time for people who have to come to an office, but the office isn't open or the office has a holiday, right? So I'm thinking I'm quoting you pretty well.
Yes, no, now I understand what you're talking about, because I usually don't make like giant claims like it occupies all space and all time. No, but exactly that. Like, so if I don't know when an office is going to be open, and I need something from that office, I'm going to show up every day at 9 o'clock until I find someone. And then what it means is I'm married to the bureaucracy. And it's like, and I'll sit there, and if I need to talk to an official, or even in some cases to talk to someone from the Secret Service so they take off my denial of entry, I can come in the morning, give my ID card, ask for an interview, and sit there till 5 o'clock in the evening and not go in, and then have to come again the next day. And it becomes almost like, at one point I called them holy places, mekomot kedoshim, because it really seemed to me almost like people, there was no rationality in coming anymore. Why are you coming to sit in this office where you're never, it's like unclear if you're ever going to get to do it. But what else can you do except do that? So that it becomes almost like this belief that you might achieve something or get something. I want to say something about not finding the source of authority. So this was something that was amazing to me. Like, I was a lawyer, I went to the Supreme Court, I went to the district courts, I went to the military courts, but I couldn't talk to anybody about this permit system because it didn't exist in law. It existed in regulation. So what you could do is, for instance, the only way you could get and talk about it is you could challenge a decision of the Secret Service, because that was something that clearly happened. But all the rest of the stuff, you could just be told, oh, there's no quotas, so this is not personal.
And the Secret Service can say it is a secret.
Yes. No, but at least, this is where things become interesting, because sometimes the certainty of the no is easier than waiting for the possible yes that never arrives. It's like a promissory note that your life is going to be okay. And then you have these brave, I represented, I think it was 80 Palestinians who were denied entry for security reasons. All of them almost workers in the construction branch of different scales. So some of them were like work managers, and some of them were specialized work people in these fields where they were very necessary, because you did need to have the backing of an employer, and you would probably get the backing of an employer only if you were specialized. But so they were quite brave to say, okay, I'm going to go challenge this in the Supreme Court. It's not an easy thing to do. It's scary, because fear of retaliation. Today, much less of that happens because there's a great fear of retaliation. But some of them did feel this, and it was quite difficult, because people really wanted to know what was said against them. But they never got to know that, because the court wanted to hold the hearing with the presence only of the Attorney General's people and the Secret Service, and without us. And if I didn't agree to that one-sided, then they would annul the case. So you had to agree either that the evidence be shown without you, or that you would pull. It's not really annulment. It's like you pull back the petition in order not to have a decision against you. And one of the things so we had a great success rate, because a lot of it was bureaucratic. We'd given these petitions, usually on Fridays or before holidays, and then we would be like, I'd call up, the lawyers and say, what can you give me? Is there anybody that you can just let go? And they did, about 30-40%, because a lot of this is not, it's arbitrary in the sense that Ilan Paz, who was the head of the civil administration in 1995, I think, so he said to me, yes, it's a list, you go in, you don't come out. So you have 80,000 people at the time, 80,000 people classified as security threats. They go into the list, but nobody sifts through the list to get them out of that list. And so it's like a revolving door that you can't come out of. So it's arbitrary also in that sense. So maybe it was true before, but now it's not true. And then, but there's nobody to talk about. And there's also, there's actually no staff. So say you had an entrepreneurial official in the civil administration that said, no, this is an injustice, we have to do it. They won't have the time.
Sounds pretty awful. Yeah, colonizing space and time may be not a bad word, but I'm not putting words in your mouth. So
no, it's not about, it's true, but I think that sometimes when we need to understand how this happens.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Where it happens, in which spaces does it happen. This thing about the file and the checkpoint really gets at the way the system eats at daily life. It makes you doubt your decisions, regret them, regret the people you know, regret the things you've done, be afraid to associate. Which I want to also make clear also that a lot of times when we speak about the bureaucracy, it sounds like Palestinians are passive within it, or that lawyers are passive within it, and this is not true. People are extremely innovative in trying to figure out what to do within it. They are trying to work around it. They find various ways, but at the end of the day, it also is a mindset in which, you know, you're always late because of something.
Yeah.
You're always missing something.
I often think of Amira Haas's chapter in a book on Gaza, Waiting to be 40, when people had to be 40 in order to be allowed out. But maybe we move back to your big book for a minute. I mean, I love Living Emergency. I think it's a wonderful book and incredibly accessible, and I really recommend it to all of you. So the question about the big book, as I call it, right, the colonial bureaucracy, what do you think you have learned about Israel-Palestine by going backwards to studying these emergency laws, which are, after all, a long time ago? So in what way do you think that this deeper past helps us understand the present?
That's a great question. First of all, we still use those emergency laws. All of them.
And Trump just uses a 1795 one right now, right? Weren't we talking about that before?
It's the same family, but it's like a distant cousin. It's a distant cousin. But yes, I mean, a lot of these. So emergency laws, what it is basically, I call it. We talked about this. I call it like monkey bars for the state. The way you can move from one set of legal tools to another without the procedure of it. So there's always this sense of
go from here to there.
Yes, but there's always more law than you need, and there's always this question: why do they need so much law? Why do they need this kind of emergency and this set of regulations and this, like, what do you need it for? Can't you just have like one rule? Do whatever you want? Like, why go through all these motions? And the truth of that is, I think at the heart also is what is happening now, and I'll get into it I hope a little bit later, is that even authoritarians need the law to legitimate what they do. And an occupation is a form of, one of the forms of authoritarian rule. And so what I learned, which I had no idea about, is the relationship between emergency law and how it creates citizenship and belonging, both to the land and to the state, through this possibility of mobility, through this possibility of access to resources. And this was something I had no idea about, even though so there's this article by my friend and colleague Elisabeth and Nadim Rouhana from very early on, where they're writing about emergency and citizenship, but it's more vague. And so suddenly it really comes out that you can classify people according to their kin, according to their region, and according to their political affiliations through emergency laws, through counterinsurgency laws. And then what happens is that those classifications become attached to possibilities for resources and for participation. So I'll give you an example, and it's fairly recent. So in 2016, after 80 years of using the emergency laws as anti-terrorism laws, the Israeli Knesset legislated an anti-terror law, in which it basically took the emergency laws and put them in, and even made some wider definitions. Now, there was a big fight about a lot of things. The Association for Civil Rights managed to get some of the stuff out. Now with this new government, it's become much more draconian. But one of the things that you see there is that one's affiliation by where they live. There's something called an area of infrastructure of terrorism. So by living in a place, that makes one already affiliated with. And what that does is, so even if you're not arrested or detained, your suspicion level is very high, meaning that's going to shift your access to various public goods and for participation. And once you see it at work, because law has this a strange quality. It's not just, I think Mark Gallanter calls it the radiating effects of courts. So you can have a court case in which the court says, no, you can't do this. You can't use this as widely. But what is remembered actually is how you can use this clause to classify. And what it does is it creates this legitimation for differentiation. That's what it does. And particularly when there is close attention to discrimination in other fields. So the security issue allows you to discriminate despite a scrutiny of discrimination. Yeah, that was a little complicated.
So that makes it, the arbitrariness slips in there.
But it is arbitrariness and not arbitrariness, because for some populations or for some cases, it's not arbitrary. It's actually a tool that is being used by a department or an official. What's arbitrary is the way it then gets interpreted by the other organs of the state or even by other population groups. What's so interesting is that here's this system, we live in it, we know it, but people don't seem to understand how this suspicion works and how these categories have effects even when they're unintended. So you have the category that is intentional, and then all the effects that are unintentional but become part of the political culture and part of the bureaucratic culture.
All right, good, thank you. So we have about 5 minutes until Q&A, but in your dissertation, you have quite a bit about gender and a kind of a gendered analysis of this whole issue. Would you say a few words about that?
Yeah.
And how it did not fit in the big book, but
right.
that it fits in the thinking about it.
So it fits in other things that are not yet published, but it didn't make it into the big book because editors are editors.
It's already big.
It's already pretty dense. They were like, we can't, it's like this other branch, no. One of the things that you find is how there's these colonial laws, for instance, colonial laws that were in place both in Mandate Palestine and in India and in Cyprus, that then are annulled in Britain, but remain in the independent states. So they're inherited by. So these and one of these laws is like marrying outside the nation. So a woman who marries someone who is not of the nation, she loses her citizenship. And this had dire consequences. It was a really big deal. And so in 48, also earlier they annul some clauses, and then in 48 they annul it entirely, and there's no more this thing of marrying outside the nation and losing your citizenship. But for instance, in Cyprus, the religious laws adopt this. So you kind of marry outside of your religion and you lose your national status because of it. And this is true also for some of the use of religious laws in Israel, Palestine, and in India, where marrying outside the nation had dire consequences during partition. So one of the things that happened is, and there's this whole thing, there's a lot of wonderful writing about it, about women who were allegedly abducted by their husbands of the other religion, and then are recovered by the state, some against their will. And what happens when in many ways make a choice that is against the nation, and the nation wants you back. So obviously it's a different. So it's also about political membership, and it's also about how these legacies of race and emergency operate, but it didn't make it into the book also because I didn't figure out also how systematic this was. So what is the mechanism that makes something stay from the colonial state to the independent state? And I think that was also a reason, so it's not just the editors, but I think that one of the things about the effect on gender is also because when emergency laws are used, so it turns into the realm of security. So all things civilian that were then delegated also to women are then repurposed and then taken out of those the more civilian realms back into the emergency and the military, and in that way, that's another layer of exclusion. We see it now to an incredible extent. I mean, in the daily life, you could really see it. And that's another way, because as soon as something is labeled as emergency, it becomes A, more important, and B, into that security realm. And so that's something that has these effects on participation. There's other aspects that are very interesting, where actually because men are considered to be more security threats than women, that sometimes women have more mobility than men. And then there's really wonderful research about how actually opportunities for employment and opportunities for decision making happen through that. I'm not even, and then what does that do? So then suddenly, because there's a necessity for mobility, so more traditional ideas about lowering mobility of the women in the family, then there's actually some gain there, but also a lot of responsibility and a lot of stress involved in that. So there's things that happen to in different directions that make significant changes in family relations, in what is called work-life balance, mistakenly, and also in kind of the relationship between also the family and the state. So moving within the order of the family and the order of the state, once it's a state of emergency, that regulation becomes more entangled and tighter.
All right, so I think we will open it up for questions. So what we'd like to do is for people to use the mic. There is a mic, I think. And we'll take 3 questions at a time so that we have a little bit, so more people can ask questions. Yep. Samara. and you can mention your name. In this case, it is Samara Millis. He's also part of this.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and talking to us. My name's Samara.
Speak up.
Oh, hi. I'm Samara. I'm in Professor Kapteijns' class, and thank you so much for coming and speaking to us. I was really interested in the idea of like suspicion that you were talking about, and wondering if maybe you could speak to how the like emergency bureaucracy and the classifications that it creates in Israel like manifest in like American understandings of what's going on in Israel and Palestine, whether that's like at the federal level or just on college campuses like you were kind of alluding to. Yeah, just if you could speak to that a little bit more.
You need time to write it down, or you?
No.
So, other question?
Not everybody at once.
We're going to wait for a second one. Yes, good.
Hello, thank you so much for speaking to us about your work. My name is Youngmin Yi, and I'm a new faculty member in the Sociology department. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about, at least in this discussion, how you've been thinking about arbitrariness, because I feel like I'm not super familiar with your work, but based on what I've like read a little bit and understood, I don't know, I guess I struggle with arbitrariness because there's kind of a longer historical legacy around the systems. So I wonder if you could clarify whether it's arbitrariness or like discretion that you're talking about, and the way that it's ruled, that it may seem chaotic or arbitrary, but actually it's not. Just play more with that concept, I guess.
No, I think we can do that. I'll start with from the second one. So, of course, it's about discretion. But one of the interesting things about a bureaucracy is when you can't find who is making the decision. And so where is that discretion? Having discretion means that someone is taking responsibility for implementing regulations on a specific case. And then at least you can know why they did it or how they diagnosed this case. But if I don't know who it is, and there's a total divorce between the person who signed a permit, the person who hands the permit, and the person who heads the department of the permit, then that, I call it phantom sovereign. It's arbitrary because you can't find the source of discretion. And when you ask the agents themselves, they also don't know what is the source of authority. They can say, oh, tell me when this was and I'll figure out who was in the office at the time. And in that sense, it's arbitrary. What if somebody was on leave? What if it was a holiday? Then it's no longer just about negligence or not caring enough about it. It's literally that the system functions in a way that you cannot challenge it in any way. And in that sense, it's arbitrary. But that's only one of the principles. So for me, like, colonial bureaucracy is a whole bunch of stuff. But the major principle is that you have a racial hierarchy. This is very important. Why is it important? Because you have separate practices for separate groups of people, and that's a principle. It's not just one time. It's just the way it works, that differentiation, that variety. The second is rule by exception, a constant creation of exception. It's constant. It's not just at one point in time and then that exception goes into the system. It is the way it works, which is why we have so much surplus law. Because you have all these exceptions. You have 105 types of permits. Why would you even need that? Some of them are not in use, then they are in use, then 40% are canceled. But because you don't have this anchor of discretion. And so that's one side of the arbitrariness. I'm also working, you can't write without Weber about bureaucracy. And so Weber's, I tried. You have these two basic things that he says. You have this principle of universalism, right? That it's supposed to be, right? without scorn and bias. It's supposed to be like that. Even though it's never like that, it's supposed to be some sort of aspiration. But when the whole system is based on a bias, that changes that vector. And so I think that, and so Weber really believed that race was a surplus category and it didn't matter that much. He was like, oh, this is another form of social closure, it doesn't really help us. I disagree. I think that race does change the way bureaucratic thinking works. And there's the other side, which is impersonality. It's supposed to be that your relationship, the relationship of the official, needs to be divorced from the decision. From that discretion has to be objective in that sense. Now, if I don't even have a relationship, there's no relationship between the bureaucrat and whoever gets the permit. So the decision itself is constantly rests on who this person might be and what they might decide at the moment. It's entirely. So it's not about what they ate for breakfast, because that would be systematic. And in that sense, there is a logic to it. It's not that it's illogical. That's why I can't stand when people say lawless, because it's so full of law. How could you say it's lawless? But it's not, the laws aren't published, the regulations aren't published. When they are published is usually in the aftermath, when they don't work anymore. This actually happened. And so you have this built-in arbitrariness that is diffused throughout the system because nobody takes responsibility. Yeah. So, yes, it absolutely affects. So the categorization of suspicion. So even this fact of calling everyone a terrorist, right? How do you know? How do you define who's a terrorist? How do you define who's a security threat? That classification doesn't just stay within Israel-Palestine. It moves because it then affects. So, for instance, if you've been in administrative detention, you have no chance of getting a visa to the United States, and you'll be perceived. I don't know if this is what you're asking about. So about the actual practicalities of the denial of entry. Yes, absolutely. Having that on your record means your mobility is curbed not only within Israel-Palestine, but also outside of it. Now, this depends, right? It depends on like affiliations, and it depends on networks, and it depends on if somebody does have citizenship somewhere in Europe. So then that might work where the classification might not travel. But when it comes to the United States, because of the shared intelligence network, so yes, it has everything to do with it.
I have two questions, but if that's too...
Speak up.
Okay. I have two questions, but if that's too greedy, I can cut one of them. Okay. So the first one, I feel like is the simpler one, so we'll start with that. But at lunch earlier, you were describing the mirror image authorities on either side and how they are so, like, characteristically male, religious, and I think you said authoritarian. And I was wondering, because the articles that we read had so much to do with the ethics of politics and how people talk to each other and how we can conceptualize something. And I was wondering if you had any ideas about how to get groups which are in their current regimes or states or whatever you want to call it, so male, religious, and authoritarian, to talk to each other in the way that was necessary according to these articles to move forward.
And the second one?
And the second one was also more generally about your vision for the future. Also in the Zreich article, I think he mentioned that, like, being part of a nation will mean that you inherently have a preference for the people of your nation. So regardless of having ill will towards somebody else? How do people who have different preferences as people of different nations share space? Or I guess the same as the gender question, how do you move forward, really?
Thanks for your talk. I'm Nikhil Rao, and I'm in the history department here. By the way, Basira is an alum of Wellesley. But I guess what, like in India, these rules, right, these emergency rules, they are, as you know, they're deployed. But the way the narrative that's constructed is that they are deployed in times of emergency. Right? They're deployed during the partition, they're deployed during the actual Indian emergency, 75 to 77. They're, of course, deployed with greater ubiquity in sort of hot zones like Kashmir or Northeast Frontier area and so on. But my sense is that in Israel, these are much more, these practices are much more woven into everyday life, right? So I guess my question is, how is the narrative of emergency deployed, or is it, if you could sort of speak to that. In other words, is it through the production of a state of continual emergency, of perennial emergency? Okay.
Great. I'll start at the end. So we'll talk about the present and then moving forward. Yes, absolutely. Israel's been in a state of emergency since 1948. That emergency state has been renewed every single year. And there, we also have different kinds of states of...
Legally, actually.
Legally. Okay. And the Supreme Court keeps telling the state, you gotta get rid of the state of emergency. Like, you have to figure out what you're doing with this. But, it's really interesting. In 1951, is the first time where the parliament Knesset tries to do away with the emergency defense regulations. They're like, this is awful. This is draconian. This is colonial. We don't want to be colonial. We want, other kinds of laws. So they set up this committee. And in the committee, there's like the Justice Ministry people, there's the Interior Ministry people, and then there's the Security Force people. Various. Lots of different security force people. And then they can't agree because the security forces people are totally married to the emergency defense regulations. They can't give up on any of them. And the Minister of and the people from the Ministry of Justice and the Ministry of Interior are like, we can't, this is not a democratic law. We're not going to make this into law. So then they come back after like 8 months of deliberation and they're like, well, we couldn't figure out a law that we all agreed on, so here's 2 drafts. And the head of the, well, it was a different type system, whatever. The head of the Knesset at the time says, what am I going to do? I'm going to put out this law, and you're supposed to, all in favor of one say yes, and and then we're going to do like a majority vote. No, you have to have a law that you stand behind. And then they tabled it. They put it away. Came back to it in '79 again. Couldn't reach an agreement because the emergency also has to do with the fact that no one could agree on a constitution. So this is all tied up, and I think this is a huge difference with India. I personally think, maybe not right now, but I personally think that really there was a real struggle to make India, the world's largest democracy in that sense. So I know that that's sometimes considered an optimistic view, but in terms of having a constitution, having people believe in it to some extent, where in Israel that question comes up and keeps getting kicked down the road because it is too complicated to figure out. And that, in that sense, so you have the emergency not only because of war or because of occupation. You have emergency because there's nothing else to rally around. And so there's a wonderful book. I don't know if anyone's interested in the effects of emergency laws on political economy. So there's this wonderful book by Yoav Mechozai from Haifa University, and he really shows how so much of financial regulation is based on the emergency laws, And then changing it means that you have to overhaul like whole sections of like industrial law and all kinds of stuff like that. And so it really makes this entrenchment. That's why the inheritance is such a burden, because it makes this entrenchment. On the one hand, it's like, for certain things, it makes things easier for the executive and gives so much power to the ministries. And on the other hand, it prevents you from reform. So, yeah. Then this is true till this new government. And then when this new government hits, this is something totally different. So, but I'm not going to get into that because it's really too complicated. Forward. So yes, actually, I mean, for many years there was a belief that the person who could make peace with the Palestinians, we obviously know that it's not all Palestinians, but was Aryeh Deri, the head of the Shas party. The Shas party is an ultra-Orthodox Sephardic party that it's literally the Sephardic party. And it was believed, so when he was the first round, he was 28 years old, first round he was Ministry of Interior, and he had very close relationships with the mayors of towns of Palestinian citizens of Israel. And many people thought at the time, oh look, there's traditional values on this side and traditional values on that side. That's the way to go when you're trying to figure out peace or life together. Totally bombed out, obviously. And what we see now also is that, but what I meant when at lunch, and this is something that could sound, yeah, probably everybody would get mad at this, but I don't care. Like, certain factions of religious Zionism and certain factions of Hamas, they think similarly about the relationship to the other, the relationship to the land, and the type of authoritarian religious rule that they would like to see. And in a way, having each other as an enemy reinforces the idea of the other as a forever enemy, as the impasse, and strengthens these aspects to a great degree. Now, it's a little simplistic what I just said, because there are multiple parts to these movements, and it's at this moment also where the strong military and annihilation mind is at work. But I really do think that there is this it's almost a balance. Now, one thing that is unknown, I think it's virtually unknown outside the country, is that the biggest campaigns against Netanyahu is that how he supported Hamas over the years with Qatari money. So I know this sounds a little weird, but this is literally in the papers every day. Called Qatargate. No, but so you have this thing where what is and I mean, that's part of when people do say, okay, what did lead up to all these years of stagnation between Israel and Gaza was the fact that it was better for those who didn't want to move ahead with negotiations to keep Hamas in power, Gaza and the West Bank divided, and in that way continue to kind of manage the conflict. And this is something that is, it's very much talked about. It's not something that is conspiratorial or weird or anything. And you have like these quotes of all kinds of, we call them the shofarot. We call them like the speakers of Netanyahu, but journalists, who are quoted saying, oh, it's much better for us because if you have, the PA, then maybe the world will think, oh, they need to move forward with these moderates. But as long as you have the extremists, then things can continue as they are. And so there is a mirroring going on there in various degrees. But again, what I said is kind of, it's superficial in the sense that it doesn't get at the variation and the complexities that are within these movements.
Yes, it makes me think of DiCapora's article in the Journal of Genocide Research that talks about genocidal mirroring. So it's actually also an argument that he makes, somewhat genocidal mirroring. And so also about the mirror image of some of the very extremist elements on both sides. So it's not a completely undiscussed idea, even I think in our historiography. But let's, we have time for a couple of questions.
She had another question, her third question was...
Oh, I'll add the second question.
Oh, yes, of course.
Thank you.
Forward. I'm part, this is not academic, I'm part of a political group called A Land for All, 2 states, 1 homeland. We're not a lot of people, but we are a few thousand Palestinians, a few thousand Israelis, more Israelis than Palestinians that are signed on for various reasons. And basically our idea is that you would have 2 states on the Green Line that would have sovereignty, but there would also be a confederation between the two to manage a lot of the things that cannot be separated. So, water and infrastructure and in foreign policy and some other things. And there would also not be a separation border. There would be freedom of movement between the 2 parts of the land because we acknowledge that for Palestinians, all of the land is historic Palestine. And for many Jews, all of the land is the land of Israel. And despite the fact that you don't have to accept that this is the truth, this is the way people perceive and experience their life and their connection. And so the idea is to try and create a situation where there's as much, so you still have national belonging, you still have sovereignty, but you have freedom of movement, and you have collaboration on a pretty high level, pretty close level, including institutions that safeguard the rights of individuals and communities within the Confederation. So some people hear this and they say, oh, it's very utopic, it's completely, unimaginable. And then we say, we live in a reality that is unimaginable, first of all. And also, our lives are entirely intertwined across the land. I mean, Palestinians and Israelis live across the land. And then so this idea that you can split it up and then move people to one side and move the others on one side, build a high wall, we're beyond that. That is impossible on many, many ways and levels. And then the question is, how do you come out of that and create a situation where you have both sovereignty and equality, not just on a personal level, but also on a collective level? Now, for many people, they hear the word equality, they're like, oh, we don't want equality. That's okay. We believe that this is the only way forward, basically, is to say, how is it that both peoples have sovereignty, have self-determination, have security, have freedom of movement across the territory, and also issues like the right of return are already considered within the agreement. Also, we have this whole part about settlers that will be able to remain on the lands if they sign on to peaceful, neighborly life. That is a very contested issue. Also we have some parts of the movement that are settlers that believe in this, but they used to be more, and now they're a tiny minority. And we also, we have people from West Bank and from the diaspora and from East Jerusalem and Palestinians of 48. But, and we had a small branch in Gaza, but that is no longer because people...
And do you have a process?
Do
you have a process, kind of a plan of action?
Oh, absolutely. There's a plan of action of how to get from here to there, except our major problem is the lack of political power, not only for an idea like ours, but generally just an idea of stopping the war. Because right now we're in a situation where our government and our prime minister's, basically his life is tied up to continuing this war. And so we're at a very difficult moment in that sense. But we're preparing, and we work a lot with creating more groups and more support for the moment when there will be the opportunity to speak about something different besides just stop the war, stop the war.
Alejandra, our last question?
Sort
Or
of
last
related,
comment?
maybe, question to that. What role does the U.S. Jewish contingency, to put it in a certain way, play, but also the religious right, which is also present in the current conflict?
So I'm from Jerusalem, and I'll always be a Jerusalemite, even though I don't live in the city anymore. And yes, I mean, the religious right in this country, especially like certain evangelical elements, it's not all evangelicals, but certain evangelical, I mean, I really saw them change the city by pouring money into settlements in East Jerusalem, by a lot of archaeological excavations that were very oriented towards one type of imagination of what is Jerusalem or what is Israel. And so, yes, there is a huge influence there. There is always the issue of AIPAC, which is no longer just AIPAC. It's many more other things, right? So I have to say that in the last 2.5 years, I haven't had any time to follow this. I do follow the weaponization of anti-Semitism campaigns, especially the IHRA, the definition of anti-Semitism that actually includes the critique of Israel. And I just want to say, first of all, that there's an alternative to that definition. We have something called the Jerusalem Declaration. It was created in Jerusalem by Israelis, Palestinians, and internationals, and American Jews that think of anti-Semitism as something different, enabling also critique of the policies of the state. I have a close friend from the movement who wrote a wonderful article in October of 23, and he wrote, "Your empathy is killing us." And he writes to the Jewish community, and he says, "You can't give us this blank check. You can't support us in this way. This is not supporting us, because there has to be that critique. There has to be that barrier that says, no, we can no longer have that policy which says the Jewish community in America supports the Israeli government no matter what it does." And I mean, it's true in this country, it's no longer true. I mean, you have a lot of different Jewish communities that think differently. And in some cases, I think totally divorced from the state, to the point where like they don't even want to hear about it, which is also sad, because why is it that AIPAC or people like that get to define everybody's relationship? You know, it's something that to me is very sad, that it changes how families see their connection. It changes how people believe in their own religion and identity and history. I mean, but I've known this since I'm very, very young, that there's a certain type of involvement that was not critical enough, and that enabled a lot of not only impunity, but also this kind of sense that being an ally meant letting the state do whatever it wanted. And it's very obvious that that's not the type of help that we need right now. And the help that is needed is this kind of, is stopping the war and stopping the fueling of it, but also stopping the use of very real, there's no doubt, there's no question of anti-Semitism and how it is on the rise. You could see it in Europe, the Front National and all the parties that last 10 days ago marched in Jerusalem on the invitation of one of the ministers of the Israeli government. It was abominable. I was happy that my father died, so he didn't have to see the people of the Front National marching in Jerusalem as if they support, it was crazy. But there is this alliance that is, I find it extremely dangerous, but also the fact that it creates an enmity and this inability to have conversations because people think that everything is that. And despite having a lot of money and a lot of power, there's no question that they are not a majority. AIPAC are not a majority. And this is, I think it's really important to keep that in mind.
Good. I think we'll end it here, right on time, but please feel free to come up and have a further conversation with Professor Berda. Thank you very much, Yael, for coming and speaking so generously to us about so many things. And everybody here is going to read her books, right? Okay, thank you all for coming.